In computing, there's a concept which is important to understand, especially in the context of cloud computing, and that's called client-server computing. So in client-server computing, you literally have a server on one end and a client on the other. So let's say in this example, we have this server on the left here. This is a web server, so it's running a website. And then we have a user using a desktop computer and a browser. And that user wants to connect to the website. So how does the user connect? Well, firstly, the client application, in this case a web browser, needs to find the server by its IP address. Now we'll talk about IP addresses a bit later on in this section so you understand a bit more about that process. But essentially the IP address is the address for this server on the internet. So it's a unique address for this particular server, and that's what computers use to find each other. So the browser will connect once it knows the IP address of the server. And because in this case we're using a web browser, we're using a protocol called HTTP. So the protocol is basically the language that's being used. And for accessing a standard website, you're using the HTTP protocol. That's the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And you also need a port. So think of the port as like the door into the computer. So when you have a server, it has certain ports on which it's listening. So you can imagine those doors are kind of open and it's saying, I'm waiting for someone to come in. And in this case, with a web server, it will be listening on port 80. It could also listen on port 443. Now that's the port for secure HTTP. In this case, we're connecting just using standard HTTP over port 80. Now the same is true for different types of services. So in this example, we have a file server and then we have a user, and he's using some kind of file browsing client. So it could be that he has a mapped file system across the network like you might for your corporate shared directories. And so he's using a file management system on his client to connect to that file server. In this case, he could be using a protocol such as the server message block by Microsoft, and that uses port 445. In another example, we have an email server. So the client here is using some email software, could be Outlook for example, and needs to send an email. Now in this case, the email goes to the mail server on the SMTP protocol. So that's the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, and that listens on port 25. So that's just a few examples. There are lots of what we call well-known ports. So these are ones that are standard ports. For instance, a website will almost always listen on port 80, and 25 is used as the standard for mail. And there's quite a few other well-known ports as well.